Thank you so much, Susan. It's really an honor to be here, and it's a little bit of a full circle for some individuals. And actually, if I did nothing but simply present to you this picture, here's an idealized conception of me. This kind of captures, in an original artwork, a bit of what we were doing. But, you know, why this title? What does the world make of it? When I began this work, I was publicly humiliated by my department chair at Albert Einstein College of Medicine and Neuroscience. What are you doing measuring the Dalai Lama's brainwaves? Which he got wrong. It was his brother's brainwaves. But, you know, when people are dying of AIDS, I didn't have the wisdom to say, people are dying of AIDS because they cannot understand the nature of their own desires, and they cannot see forward the consequences of their actions. So there's been an arc from an extraordinary, skeptical, almost derisive regard for work like this in the academy, to now a pervasive mainstream media. You can't walk 2 feet without hearing about mindfulness. So we saw recently the second Time magazine cover, and we won't get into the social, cultural ethics of the model choice. But there is a meme, a loose in the culture, that meditation might be almost a panacea. The mighty powers of meditation. Now, from a scientific point of view, almost every single one of the claims here has to be qualified or could be disputed. Yet it's packaged as together it's a real panacea. This is a quote from Arianna Huffington. This is an interesting article to make a killing on Wall Street start meditating. Data from the project I'm going to describe to you is in this article. I spent 2.5 hours talking to the reporter about ethics. And what's in here? Improving your visual perception so that you can catch the ticker tape faster than the next guy on the trading floor. So this is a real-life moment from Hollywood that's almost documentary. And of course we have Best Dressed Monk. There is a store from 2 guys who went seeking enlightenment and came back with a bunch of cashmere. The store is in LA, where else? I actually showed this at a retreat center at Spirit Rock, and Mark Coleman was the teacher. He actually is a model for some sports hiking clothes, and everybody laughed and looked at the meditation teacher. It's very funny. But on the other hand, we have this. This is a study published in Science this summer. If you take individuals, not just college kids, but if you recruit at the mall, and you put them in a room, and you take away their smartphone, the experience of being alone with your thoughts is so often highly aversive that many people would rather shock themselves than sit alone. Of course, they did 11 studies in this paper, but they never once gave an instruction how to pay attention to your thoughts. In fact, they end the article describing meditation, why so many people are interested in meditation, so they can control their thoughts, as opposed to relate to them with a little more gentleness, spaciousness, and kindness. So there may be something that needs to address this fact.
That was done here.
That was done here. Wow. Where are they here, the authors? It would be really interesting to talk to them. Because this is a siloization. Since you're in a, well, we can talk. So from the point of view of research, there are two questions that I focus on. What do people do when they meditate? What is practiced? This is a question that many people are interested in, and it's one that I think is nearly intractable to answer, because there are interpersonal and intrapersonal variability in the way anyone takes up a meditation instruction, what they actually do. We heard at the International Symposium of Contemplative Studies just yesterday, Tanya Singer is finally, someone is biting the bullet and doing a phenomenological elicitation interview, spending 1 hour to simply try to describe 5 seconds of the experience of watching your breath. We really have very little idea what people do when they meditate. So we publish what we tell them to do. And everybody thinks, or at least we don't get reviews back that say, but how do you know that? But maybe we're going to begin to. We also have individual differences in how people change over time when they do the same practice for the same period of time. And we have physiological change, remapping, memory consolidation. Paul Grossman and I coined the term the Tuchis effect. Now that plays a lot better in New York, but this is Yiddish for your bum, your behind. What are the neurophysiological consequences of the radical behavior change, particularly as a function of retreat experience, of sitting still for so long, of walking slowly for so many hours in a retreat context? But all of that aside, there's likely something about quiescence. It's a new movie title. But there's another question we can ask. What do people do differently because they've meditated? We don't know exactly what they're doing, but we can measure using established research paradigms the consequences of this training, as we might apply it to the consequences of any kind of training. Tennis players, musicians, golfers. We have trait changes in experimental settings we can measure. We can ask questions about changes in personality and worldview. And we can integrate the first-person perspective of the participants, second-person perspectives of people close to them, and third-person or laboratory measures or more validated self-report measures at some level we can collect in the laboratory. And these things, of course, are recursive. Now, why am I showing you a weather map? This is actually a multi-dimensional representation of a conceptual model of fluctuations in your local environment day by day. We can make a similar model about states of mind and sub-processes that we can assess experimentally. So this tells us not just north, south, east, west, but we have a map of pressure, we have wind direction, we have wind speed by the number of flags, we have cloud cover by the coloring in these holes, and of course these points are of special relevance for this talk because these are areas of calm. So with my colleagues Amishi Jha and Antoine Lutz and John Dunn, we've been working for a number of years on trying to take the complexity of thinking about a term such as mindfulness or how one might progress and in a contemplative path and creating a phenomenological state-space model. So think of a cube. And I'm going to tell you that it isn't the case that the dimensions I'm going to put on here are strictly orthogonal. They may be locally orthogonal, but there may be points in this cube that do not make sense. So for the purposes of visualization, heuristics, pedagogy, and communication, we're making orthogonal assertions, but we're not heavily tied to them. And this is a provisional, evolving model, and one that's really designed to spark elaboration, corroboration, and conversation. So the first dimension that we can think of if we want to use a model like this to conceptualize what's cultivated in contemplative practice might be object orientation. To what degree are you on an object? If the meditation instruction is focused, say, on the tactile sensations of breathing, which was a primary root practice in a lot of what I'll talk about, you might have sometimes, 1 out of every 6 breaths you really capture. Or you might be extremely focused and you'll be very oriented on the object. So this is a dimension. Another dimension we call de-reification. We ordinarily have a thought and take the thought to be true. Yesterday, I asked someone at the airport in Boston what the call letters were of the airport in Charlottesville, and they said CLT. You might know what happened. So I'm waiting at baggage claim in Charlotte, and then I go because my bag hasn't come. I had completely reified that my destination was CLT. And there I was at the baggage counter saying, my bag didn't come. And they said, you're not going here, you're going to CHL, because I've never been here before. That's a good example of reification, because I actually saw in my itinerary I was arriving at 7:17. But since I thought I was going to CLT, I thought, oh good, they got it wrong, I'll be there early. Taking thoughts as accurate representations of reality is reification. Seeing thoughts as objects whose truthiness is kind of an op-ed piece is along the way of de-reification. This is also termed decentering in mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, diffusion in acceptance commitment therapy. And we have a third dimension, which we call reflective awareness. Reflective awareness is a capacity to actually deeply encode what is happening moment to moment while you're on an object. It's the periphery. It's what might be seen as incidental to the task of the moment, yet without those incidentals, you wouldn't be able to enact the task. You want to pick up the bottle, so I'm thirsty and I can drink, but what does it feel like to extend my arm while I'm doing that? That would be, if I could report post hoc what the arm movement felt like, that would be an example of reflective awareness. This is a capacity that also facilitates monitoring whether you're on or not an object. So we actually, those are 3 dimensions, and we have 4 subsidiary qualities. We could be on an object, but in fact, it could be a candle flame, or it could be the field of all mental events. So we have a sense of aperture. It could be, I'm on the object, but I'm really pretty sleepy. I barely have enough energy to go off the object. I'm entranced by the object. So I have a kind of dullness. So there's a sense of clarity increasing to vividness and vivid perception. And of course there's how stable are we? What's the probability that the next time point will find us at the same place in this space? Or there's another way to think about stability. In response to perturbation, how far do I extend out from where I was, and how quickly do I come back? And finally, there's a sense of effort. Often at the beginning, things are very difficult, but they get easier with practice. So we can put addictive craving in this place, and we can say it's got a narrow focus. It's usually may or may not be so clear, but it doesn't take much effort for addictive craving to arise. It's low de-reification, very high object orientation, low reflective awareness. If we think about focused attention meditation for novices, there's a high effort, a narrow aperture, not so much clarity. But if you look at the trajectory from initiation and novice level to, these are, by the way, hypothetical locations. We just sort of made a MATLAB program and said, what do we think, where would people be? One could imagine developing metrics and actually populating this with real data. This is just for the purposes of thinking about the effects of consequence, of training and levels of expertise. When you have more expertise, you get greater reflective awareness, you have increased clarity, much less effort in focused attention. And there are other practices, open monitoring practices where there's a large aperture, and it could even be, there are certain practices where the notion of aperture might not make sense. So here is rumination, where you have a fair degree of object orientation. There's not much effort to keep it going. There may be effort to suppress it. And mind wandering, of course, takes no effort whatsoever. I'm going to spend the rest of today talking about focused attention meditation primarily. But this is a heuristic. This is not our explanation of how it all works. So we don't want to say, this is our model of mindfulness. The disclaimers I could go into for the rest of the talk, but then we wouldn't get very far. So I'm going to talk about the fact that this isn't the first time I've thought about this stuff. Here's Richie Davidson and me in 1977. You might have been delayed at the airport had we come into the terminal at that time. Richie was supposed to present information of our work to the Dalai Lama in 1990 at the third Mind and Life conference. He couldn't go, and he asked me 3 weeks before the meeting. So I was, my life has not been the same since. So here in 2009, I'm presenting some of the data from this project to His Holiness. And here's Richie and I, cleaned up and aged, at least I am, at Rockefeller University a couple of years ago. So we had an initial project in 1992. This is Dharamsala. And I had the opportunity to room with Francisco Varela, the father of this dialogue between cognitive science and Buddhist practice and philosophy, and met Alan Wallace, who is the teacher in our project, and here he is talking to the Dalai Lama about it. So we met some extraordinary, inspiring monks. We talked to. This fellow told us about the quality of the way he worked with his mind. It was like talking to someone who is a craftsman, a great cabinet maker who lovingly pulled out the felt line drawers in his wooden cabinet of tools and talked about, when my mind is turbulent, I do this practice. When I'm feeling despondent, I do this practice. When I feel overexcited, I calm myself down with this practice. Most monks, they said, well, why are you trying to study meditation? If you want to know about meditation, you meditate. And how can you measure the mind? The mind is the space in which phenomena arise. How are you going to do that? Here was a monk who is doing a sustained attention orientation task. It's interesting, if you give a covert orienting task where you have a cue that predicts where a target will come to undergraduates, and sometimes you trick them by putting the cue in the wrong direction and the target still comes to the other side, they just take it. He said, "Why are you lying to us?" So we had to change the paradigm, so the cue is always predictive. Here we're showing emotional eliciting films, filming facial expression. I'll tell you more about that later. And here is Francisco, there's Richie Davidson, and they're all laughing because we are measuring the head, but everybody knows this is the mind. Why are we putting a silly cap on the head? The cross-cultural issues involved in this is written up in a chapter in the book Visions of Compassion. And finally, we encountered a monk who gave us a kind of, I want to say drosh, but a teaching on the nature of compassion that changed our lives. He wouldn't participate in any of our tests, but he changed our lives pretty easily. And we asked about the difference of sadness and compassion. And he talked about how sadness could elicit and could be a catalytic agent for the arising of genuine compassion. But he also talked about how one had to love the conditions of suffering as a mother would love a child in order to see clearly into the causes and conditions of what we were perceiving, while at the same time having your heart broken. We have 4 scientific goals of the project I'm talking to you about. Can focused attention meditation help train attention? Can training in loving kindness and compassion improve emotion regulation? Are improvements in attention related to improvements in psychological function? And what are the physiological changes that accompany these effects? So I'll be talking to you 10 years into the beginning of this project. It is a work in progress. And I now know that if I came here in a decade, I will be saying, I've been working on this for 20 years, and it's a work in progress. I begin with an extraordinary debt of gratitude to an extraordinary crew of investigators at Davis. Baljinder Sadra on the current funded project is my co-PI in Australian Catholic University in Australia, in Sydney. And I have students and postdocs at Davis and elsewhere, and a tremendous group of consulting scientists, and Susan is among them. I'm very grateful. We'll talk about her work later. And our funding has come from a whole variety of sources. And if you want your name on this list, I'll be happy to talk to you. So what did we do? In 2007, Alan Wallace taught 2 3-month Shamatha retreats. We had 60 participants randomly assigned to 2 training groups, a waitlist control group and initially the participants in the first 3-month retreat. Now, people who are able and interested in doing a 3-month meditation retreat are not necessarily representative of the general population. So if you're going to compare those individuals with the effects of training, you need to have a matched group of individuals equally committed to this practice, equally interested in doing a 3-month retreat. But in fact, you don't have them do a retreat. You have them do a retreat later. So we took 60 people, randomly assigned them to 1 or 2 retreats. So you have to understand the commitment that would be required to be a participant in this study. We're going to say, would you like to do a 3-month retreat? And we won't tell you for a long time which 3-month retreat you're going to be in. And if you're not in the first retreat, we're going to fly you 3 times to the retreat center during the first retreat, test you just like everyone else. But you won't be meditating, but you'll be at a meditation center. Then 3 months after the end of the first retreat, you'll enter your own 3-month retreat, and then we're going to, well, we didn't know it at the time, but we're going to follow you for quite a while. So we're now at the 7-year follow-up point. So this is the structure. This was in 2007. So we have assessments pre, mid, and post of the retreat group, and we fly the control group into the retreat center, and then we have the second retreat. So the people in the second retreat have their extensive baseline data from when they were control subjects, and we have a comparison group that's matched on many different dimensions during the first retreat. That's the design. And we have follow-up at 5, 15, and now 6, well actually now it's 7 years. What are we assessing? What kind of training? For focused attention practice, the emphasis was on 3 primary qualities: relaxation, stability, and the cultivation of perceptual clarity and vividness. And the practices were done about 6 hours a day for most people. Mindfulness of breathing, simultaneously with the need to focus on an object is the monitoring broader requirement to pay attention to the quality of attention. Am I feeling lethargic? Am I feeling excited? Is there a sense of neutrality and stability? And applying antidotes for each of these extremes of excitement and laxity. Then the focusing on the flux of all mental events, and a third practice, awareness of awareness. But you don't just want to sit trying to be, you know, a radar operator of your own mind staring at a screen. You need to really develop patience, openness. So we have opening the heart experience, training, cultivating classically the 4 Brahma-Viharas, or the 4 immeasurables. And of course we want to measure the 4 immeasurables. But they're immeasurable in this extent that there is no end to the degree to which they can be cultivated. So these are loving kindness, compassion, empathetic joy, and equanimity. So what do we expect to happen? Well, improved ability to focus and sustain attention. Increased ability to withhold inappropriate responses. Increased ability to engage with suffering when it arises in self and other. These things are at some level preparatory, because I think the fundamental center of gravity that's emerging from our commitments to this project really center around this: the increased ability to engage with suffering when it arises in self or others. And out of that, possibly an increase in pro-social tendency. So we have a whole bunch of experimental tasks, looking at physiology during meditation, daily diary questionnaires, a battery of social psych questionnaires at the beginning and end, structured interviews, emotion-related tasks, attention-emotion interaction tasks, and a whole bunch of attention-related tasks. We actually had many measures from EEG and autonomic activity, startle responses, how well people did on tasks, with code facial expressions of emotion. So this is an enormous complexity of multidisciplinary mixed methods approach. Because if you ask, well, what aspects of your life are impacted by intensive contemplative practice? We had 3 years to try to answer that question, and we just kept finding more aspects of life, from your affiliative and stress hormones to your worldview. So this is a list of the laboratory computer-based tasks, and I'm only going to talk about a few. The plus signs mean the 2 plus signs mean we have really quite convincing evidence of improvements along what we predicted the impact would be. Single signs are not fully analyzed at this point. I'm only going to talk about a few things because there isn't much time. So here's where this project took place. the Shambhala Mountain Center in Red Feather Lakes, Colorado. Here is Alan Wallace, now gray like the rest of us, teaching in the second retreat. And downstairs behind this door, we built a laboratory. So we have a EEG lab that had a control room, and we presented tasks to people. And this is an example of a motion potentiated startle experiment with emotionally eliciting, difficult to look at images. Here we have 88 channels of EEG. So if we just start looking at some data, how does one's mood state change over time? So this is the positive and negative affect scale that people filled out every day as a mood state checklist. They rated on 1 to 7 how they felt about these terms, and then when we add them all together, we see in the control group, which is in red, there actually was very little change over time, but there's this slow growth of positive affect, positive mood in the retreat group. What's interesting about this is it suggests it's not just a vacation effect. And of course, any of you who've gone on retreat know that retreats are not exactly vacations. The control group, compared when they were coming as controls, compared to themselves when they're on retreat, replicates the same pattern as the first retreat group. And when you get a replication like that, that really suggests this is not a fluke. What about psychological traits overall? We combined many questionnaires into a single adaptive functioning measure. This is the work of Baljinder Sadra, published in Emotion. So we add together a whole bunch of constructs that are positive, and improvements in these and decreases in these constructs come up together to our latent construct variable we call adaptive functioning. And when we look at that, we see that the control group does not change between the beginning and end of the first retreat. They're flying in for 5-6 days at a time, going back to their daily lives. But the retreat group, that we match them together at the pre-point, the retreat group actually significantly improves, and then 5 months later also shows significant improvement. The control group, when they do their own retreat, shows exactly the same pattern. Another replication. But people were invested in the project, and because of item response biases and teaching about mindfulness and compassion and loving kindness and focus and openness, there might be many ways in which people unconsciously bias their responses to questionnaires. There is published data by Nick Van Dam and Paul Grossman about item response bias. If you give some mindfulness questionnaires to individual before and after mindfulness training, about 10% of the variance is accounted for by differences in the way people actually understand the meaning of items of the questionnaire. So let's look at some biology, which is really hard to fake. So this is telomeres. This is work done in collaboration with Alyssa Epple and Liz Blackburn at UCSF and Zhu Lin. Liz won the Nobel Prize along with her colleagues for discovering telomeres, the caps that protect the ends of the chromosomes, and the enzyme telomerase. So every time your cells divide, they cannot copy the exact end of the DNA. It's like a zipper on a jacket is not a zipper all the way down. It has a kind of slug at the bottom of metal. So the DNA replication complex has to bind somewhere, and then it copies downward, but it can't copy where it binds. So the telomere gets shorter, but there's an enzyme, telomerase, which actually has the capacity to rebuild this telomere. And your telomere length is related to your longevity. And we find at the end of the first retreat, we couldn't measure this at the beginning because we hadn't set up the laboratory blood lab for it. This is published in Psychoneuroimmunology. Tanya Jacobs was a postdoc responsible for these analyses. We find a 30% increase in telomerase compared to the control group at the end of 3 months. But what's really amazing is to consider that levels of telomerase relate to psychological change in the project. So this is levels of telomerase at 3-month end point as a function of the change, in a sense, of purpose in life. Purpose in life is one of the 8 aspects of Carol Riff's well-being questionnaire. And you see here in the retreat group, this is the first retreat group, there's a strong relationship between positive change in life as a sense of purpose in life. This is the degree to which your current goals and beliefs and activities are in line with your past activities and beliefs. And there's no relation in the control group. But it's really important to see that there were some individuals whose sense of purpose decreased. So when you have you cannot make a box and say a person comes in, does a 3-month training as it unfolded, and they always have a uniform psychological consequence. And that purpose in life related to the level of telomerase they had, the change in purpose in life. This was similar for a sense of environmental mastery, and also as people had decreased neuroticism as measured by the Big 5 inventory, they also had increased telomerase. We're replicating this now at a 1-month retreat at Spirit Rock Meditation Center, a somewhat different training, different populate new set of subjects, and we don't have the data yet. They're at Julin and Liz Blackburn's lab in their freezer. We're waiting with bated breath. What about attention? We have a very boring task, because if you're going to sit for almost 900 hours, and we should give you a really boring task to see how your attention, sustained attention might improve, because one of the fundamental commitments of the practice is to improve your sense of stability of attention. So you see a dot, then you see a long line. And 90% of the time, the line is long. Then the line goes away because it's only on the screen for about 1/10 of a second. And then you might see, 10% of the time, a short line. But that's not what a short line looks like. We make this real hard because we take 15 minutes to establish your individual psychophysical threshold. We take the short line and we make it longer and longer and longer until you can't tell if it's long or short. And when it's so close to a long line that you're performing a chance, we back it off just a little bit so that only 75% of the time can you tell if it's long or short. And now we say, okay, now that you can barely tell if it's long or short, for the next 32 minutes, without interruption, press the button every time you see a short line. Sound boring? Sound hard? And the better you get at this in the first retreat, the harder we made it. So we actually also flip that around and we say, instead of just pressing the button when you see a short line, press the button every time you see a long line, and the target now when you see a short line is don't press the button. So one is vigilance, and the other is response inhibition. So this is published in Psychological Science. Catherine McLean found looking at the first 16 minutes of this task. This is data from the second retreat. These are multiple baselines from when they were control subjects, the midpoint and at the end of the first retreat, the beginning of the second retreat. You see this vigilance decrement, which has been well known since this tradition of work comes out of testing radar operators in the Second World War. TSA agents at the airport, they throw in guns and bombs and knives randomly into the images on the X-ray scanners just to keep you vigilant. So you see an improvement in the stability of the sustained attention. Their vigilance appears to improve, but in fact, it's primarily due to, for both retreats, a significant improvement in visual perceptual threshold. People's ability to detect a long line and a short line difference got better across the course of the retreat. And even at 5 months after follow-up, we send laptops to people, and we actually have them create labs in their bedrooms, closets, wherever. And they do the same task with the same software on a little laptop that we did in the laboratory. So 5 months after the project, people who meditated about 40 minutes a day or more maintained their improved perceptual threshold at 5 months. So we're analyzing the brainwave activity of the way people's brains respond to these long and short lines, trial by trial. So this is not just hot off the press, it's still, drying. This is data from one subject, but I want to show you where we're going with this. This is the work of Siobhan Powers in my lab, a postdoctoral fellow. And here, this is a graph where color represents the intensity of a brain response, and these are about 700 small half-second snippets of neural activity recorded from back here on the right occipital parietal region. It's where the electrode is. And we're going to focus on this early visual response and this secondary blue area. And this is at the beginning of the retreat. And what you can see is that there's a very weak response at about 110 milliseconds. And this is, as you go forward up this graph, it's later in time. So this is the first few minutes, the first 16, 15 minutes of the task, and the second half of the task. And you see this response decreases its strength. And there's a lot of variability in this red response, but it's less variable overall than this blue one. At the midpoint, you see this is a slightly different scale, so things are a little more colorful. But the point is, there is more activity across more of the 32 minutes for this component. And at the end of the retreat, there is this increased stability. So if you just look at this, this is for one individual. We will do this for the whole project. But there is a growth of brain response stability across the 32 minutes. And these are like these incredibly, extraordinarily small 10 microvolt squiggles we record from the top of the head after we go through a very arduous process of removing muscle tension and eye blinks and all kinds of other things. And we are going to be looking at the activity that precedes the stimulus to see whether or not what actually is cultivated in this training is not sustained attention like an isometric squeezing of a barbell rather, but a fluxing. If you've just seen the stimulus, there's not another stimulus for a whole second and a half. So why not chill? Who can chill for a second and a half? And then come back, and then chill, and then come back. And maybe what sustained attention actually is the expenditure and replenishment of attentional resources with moment-to-moment flexibility. I will squander my attentional resources, which are limited, if I'm ready for a stimulus I know won't come. So let me just relax and attend. And we may be able to find in the interstimulus interval, the activity before and after these stimuli, the effects we're looking for. We begin to see that there's increased activation of visual cortex before a stimulus. Can't go into this in detail, but we'll have much more to say about this. If we flip the task around, response inhibition improves. This is across the 32 minutes. And it's actually related to that psychological adaptive functioning. To the ability, to the extent people get better in physically withholding, pushing a button, it actually predicts their psychological improvement on all those constructs. That's like profound to me. And we know that through this very simple statistical model, which I cannot fully explain to you. Because this statistics was not invented when I was in graduate school. We've replicated this finding in terms of response inhibition improvement before and after a 1-month Vipassana retreat held at Spirit Rock Meditation Center. What about meditation? We're not actually going to do this. I meant to take this slide out because we don't have enough time. But if I can talk about it at the end. What about emotion? We expect that we'll become more calm, less reactive. But we also care about the spark to the flame. You could have an emotional trigger, you could notice the trigger, but maybe the consequences of this training allows you to reframe the consequence of the trigger so it does not erupt into a full-blown contemplative, not contemplative, full-blown emotional reaction. So you could become more aware of your triggers, the immediate sensations in your body, the behavioral responses or choices that you have. But we want to look at the change in the type of emotion that arises. So we expect decreased rejection emotions in encountering suffering. What is rejection? Contempt, anger, and disgust. So if we present to you an image of a suffering person, is that a disgusting stimulus? Do you have contempt for the situation or the perpetrators? Does it make you angry? These things may be, at some level, defensive reactions to simply allowing yourself to contemplate the reality of suffering. We expect, in fact, increases in sadness in response to suffering, and less rejection. So I don't have time to show you a movie clip that we showed people at the end of the retreat, so I'm going to show you a few excerpts in terms of stills. But we have a paradigm where you're going to look at what the person sees, and you're going to see their unobtrusively videotaped face. So we have permission to show this individual, and you're going to see what their face looked like while they saw the clip, the image of this clip. This is work that was spearheaded by Erica Rosenberg, who's a world expert on facial analysis of muscles on the face for emotion. This is in revision in the journal Emotion. I'm going to show you some graphic images, so I want to warn you. So here is these are documentary footage from the Iraq War. Here's a soldier talking with remorse about how being in Iraq was not like playing a video game. 12 seconds of facial behavior from this individual turns into all of these numbers. What the action unit of 46 muscle groups of the face, its intensity, its start time to the nearest frame, peak contraction, and end time. We take event codes and we combine them together, and we can apply this into an emotion dictionary. Now, it shouldn't take, this takes 150 times real time. It's a good day's work to do a minute of analysis. It's a Talmudic endeavor. And this has all been done by hand by my extraordinary team of graduate students, Tony Zanesco and Brandon King, with Erica's help. Doesn't take all that effort to know that that's an image of sadness and grief, does it? But if we want to be objective and have a complete spatiotemporal database and be able to look at moments of emotion, and then we also ask people how they felt, but I'll get to that in a moment. What we find is that we showed another film at the beginning of the retreat that was also very disturbing. And the likelihood of showing sadness, this is what's called a zero-inflated Poisson model, because there are a lot of instances where there are no expressions. There's no difference in the likelihood of retreatants or controls to show sadness. And if they did show sadness, there's no difference in the number of sadness expressions. After the retreat, there is a significant increase in the probability of showing sadness for the retreat group compared to the control group. This is not a statistically significant difference in the number of sadness expressions that they showed, if they showed sadness. But this means that you're more likely to show sadness in the retreat group. If we look at the rejection graph, because this is a different scale, it looks like there's a significant difference, but this is not statistically significant at the beginning, nor are the number of rejection expressions different if rejection expressions occur. After training, both groups are equally likely to show anger, contempt, or disgust. But if they do, there are significantly fewer anger, contempt, or disgust expressions in the retreat group. Now you might know, not quite know, your reaction till you in fact have one, and then in the presence of having the reaction, you actually catalyze a whole series of elaborate reframing and understanding, dipping into your wisdom reservoir, if there is such a thing, and you reframe the ongoing unfolding of your experience. So if I get angry for a moment, the next moment I actually may relax in a way differently than if I didn't have the training. So this decreased frequency may be incredibly meaningful as a signature of the enactment of an emotion regulation fluency strategy. We show people storyboards of the film, and we ask them every time their emotions change to rate on a grid of 13 emotions what they felt. What we did is we looked at self-report ratings that occurred close in time to the moments we thought people were sad. After the retreat, trainees reported significantly higher sympathy and distress than the controls. But they didn't report they were sad. So we were using the facial action coding system to get an image of sadness, when in fact, this may be the facial sign of a kind of empathic concern, an other directed affect that's not our simple, I feel sad. Because they're saying they feel sympathy. There was no relation between sadness and sympathy in the control group. So they throw into question the meaning of the sadness questions. They suggest that the project has given a qualitative change in everyday perceptions of suffering, which may facilitate the arising of compassion. So finally, Baljinder Sadra, who sat the second retreat, interviewed everyone, beginning, middle, and end, in a series of questions, structured interviews. We're now doing this 6 and 7 years later, and she and Susan Bauer-Wu and Rachel Whitworth actually coded 99 interviews and created an extraordinary coding scheme. We're adding together across all of our questions. And here are some examples of the codes that came up. And this is data that is also hot off the press from a poster presented Saturday at the International Symposium of Contemplative Studies. This is extraordinary work forwarded by Jen Pokorny, a scientist in my lab, and Alex Norman, who is a sociologist, religious studies, qualitative data expert in Baljinder Sadra's lab in Australia, and we're coding this one question. How would you describe or summarize your current perspective on an approach to life, including your goals, priorities, and everyday activities? And Alex and Jen are doing what's called open coding. They're going through the answers to this question, and whenever someone in their own way makes a word, a phrase that we can pull out as a kind of conceptual pin we want to put on a map, we make a network, this is when the principal investigator slips and says we. Jen makes a network that actually arrows mean direction in time. If things co-occur, they're bidirectional. If they occur and then come out later, their arrow is unidirectional. Things that feel like they're being talked about at the same time are very related to each other, are in the same color. And you actually, if we had clear enough projection, we could walk ourselves through the narrative just by the single terms that are used here. So clearly you see gratitude and family as central things. The size of the node is a function of how many connections it has. This is at the beginning of the retreat, and we can make a map. The second retreat, in the middle of the retreat, what is got a central theme is care for others, service to others. And at the end of the retreat, I really love this center point of unchanging wisdom. So I'm running out of time, but I'll tell you that we're very excited about this approach, which we will develop another layer above to pull out commonalities of meaning change across individuals, and there are network analytic metrics that we can use to relate first-person subjective worldview and meaning changes to the kinds of objective measures we measure in the laboratory. So I'm done. I'm out of time. And those of you who can stay, we still have the room. There are many important issues for design and methodological issues in this kind of work, but I rather hear what comes up for you, and I can go through those at some time for whoever is left standing or sitting. Thank you so much.